So tonight, from Whence Comes Beauty? And it's a look at how religion and philosophy have shaped aesthetics in the Western world. Now, before we can do this, it's important for you to understand the complete history of Western architecture. So I'm going to ask you to hold on. We're going to try to get through this material, because then I can start talking about the philosophies and the religious influences. So get ready. We'll work our way through this. I said I'd get you out of here. So I've got about 5,000 years of history I need to cover before we get started, okay? The history of Western architecture. The Egyptians started it, the Greeks perfected it, and everyone has been copying the Greeks ever since, except for the Gothics and the moderns. Okay? That's it. That's the complete history of Western architecture. So, I think we have more time. So, I throw this out there that everyone's basically been copying the Greeks, except for the Gothics or the moderns. And people will say, well, what about the Romans? Well, the Romans were copying the Greeks. Rome, when it began to expand, when the first Etruscan warriors were conquering the Greek colonies, first on the peninsula of Italia, and then eventually in Sicily, as they were burning and pillaging and marauding, they were looking at the architecture and saying, this is pretty neat stuff. And to prove to the world that they were not just a bunch of warriors who maraud and pillage and otherwise destroy towns, that they were cultural, they began to adopt Greek culture as a way to show how erudite they were. In fact, they not only adopted Greek architecture, but they adopted Greek mythology. They adopted the Greek language, was actually the language of the court, that is, of the elite people in Rome. Latin was still the language of law. So they began to adopt that culture. And it is true that Greek aesthetics and Roman engineering became the most dominant force in architecture in the Western world. And then through the British Empire, it got brought over to the Eastern world as well. So without a doubt, that's been the most influential form of architecture. Now we'll get into then sort of the three major philosophies of Western architecture: Greco-Roman, Gothic, and modern. But this is not going to be the kind of architecture talk you're used to. Most of the time you see architecture discussed on TV shows. It's all about the how. How do they build the pyramids? How do they build the temples? And how do they do all this stuff? And the how is actually pretty mundane. I mean, the reality is if you have a couple of thousand slaves and not a lot else for them to do, you can get them organized with a good military, and you can start building things, and it's really a matter of hoists and the 5 simple machines, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, the interesting question hasn't been how. That's a problem that's easily solved. To me, the more intriguing question is why. If I'm Pharaoh, and I've just conquered most of northern Africa, and I'm in charge, and I'm rich, and I can have all the parties I want, why am I going to make more work for myself in order to build a pyramid or a temple at Karnak or anything like that? Why don't I just sit back and relax? Because it takes a lot of resources to build these buildings. So to me, the interesting question is why. And one of the things we'll see tonight is how the people who built the great buildings were compelled by their belief system in order to build greatness, in order to find beauty, as a way to please their God, or at least try to achieve some sort of form of immortality on earth. So it was always about reaching beyond just the immediate comforts of life, but it was about reaching outside of themselves to find beauty and to find immortality and to please. So let's start with the Greeks. And when I'm talking about the Greeks, I'm talking about the Hellenistic period. And at the time that we had, about 600 BC, we had an occurrence of the naturalist philosophers. They were looking for order in nature. They were beginning to reject the myths of their previous period that explained where things came from. Why does the sun move across the sky? Because Apollo pulls it in his chariot. They began to reject that and say, why don't we look at nature and finally find out what's really going on? These were called the naturalist philosophers. And there was a whole lot of they also gave us a lot of things such as pi, which is the ratio between the radius and the circumference of a circle. And one of the more interesting things they gave us is something that's known as the golden section or the golden mean. And this is a formula that if you create a rectangle of a certain proportion such that a plus b divided by a equals a divided by b, you get something that they call phi. And it's this irrational number of 1.6803 goes on. And you say, that sounds nice, but what does that mean? Well, what's interesting about that is that this rectangle then can be perpetuated and found in nature in all sorts of different ways. And one of the ways you hear is we have a number of golden sections generating by their vertices, as they spiral outward, the vertices of a scroll, very much like a nautilus shell. And what they began to see was that in nature, there were certain ratios and proportions that were inherent as a way that nature organized themselves. 1,500 years later, Fibonacci, the Italian Renaissance mathematician, discovered the same thing in his Fibonacci series. 0 plus 1 equals 1, 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, 2 plus 3 equals 5. And that became, like the golden section, an ordering system, so that even all the stamen and all the arrangement of the inner circles of a flower are governed by mathematics. They're not just random. Tree branches sprout off at trees at certain prescribed ratios and proportions. This is what the Greek philosophers, the naturalist philosophers, were discovering. And they took this knowledge and they began to apply it to all sorts of things. One of the other things that they were looking at, they were postulating about the other nature, was the four elements. So earth, wind, fire, and water. It's not a 70s funk group. Okay. This is what they postulated, that these were the four elements. There were only four. We now know, 100 plus, still counting. These were the four elements. These were the things that could not further be subdivided. And these made up all of nature. Okay? So, for instance, if you have a horse, right? And the horse is running around, but then the horse dies. What happens to the horse? Well, before it died, it was this perfect balance of earth, wind, fire, and water. And then when it died, what happens? Well, the first thing is it gives up its wind. It stops breathing. And the next thing, it gets cold. It's given up its fire. And if you let it out there in the desert long enough, it would give up its water and it would decay. And that was what they looked at, and that's what they saw, and that's how they reasoned that all happened. Hippocrates came along and related these four elements to the human body. So that black bile was related to earth. I still don't know where black bile is. I'm not sure I want to find out. Blood was related to wind. Yellow bile related to fire. And phlegm was related to water. This was the predominant theory of medicine through the Middle Ages. All right? So if you went into your barber or physician, didn't matter in the Middle Ages, and you said, I have too much wind, they would want to bleed you. Because your four humors, your four elements were out of balance, and that's where disease came from. Now, if, 300 BC, you were walking around Greece saying, no, this isn't what causes sickness. It's these little tiny things that we can't see that get into our bloodstream, and they create infections. They would have thought you were crazy. They would have thought that you were not in touch with the current scientific knowledge. Okay? So that's one of the things we have to be careful about scientific knowledge, is that there's a prescribed way of thinking, which if you don't prescribe to that, you're considered stupid. All right? But until someone comes along and says, wait, guys, this isn't the way it is. So Giorgio Vasari was talking about how the great artists look directly at nature, and then the following generations of artists look at the great artists. This makes a lot of sense. So the Greeks were looking directly at nature, and most of we architects for the next 2,000 plus years have been looking at how the Greeks did it. We weren't looking at it directly ourselves. So, what did the Greeks see when they looked at nature? Well, they saw that nature had beauty in it, and they were, through their observations, mathematically, were seeing that there was an ordering system to these things, so that when they began to build their architecture, they began to learn the lessons of nature and build it in such a way to imitate nature. So their goal was to create in stone, create permanently, imitations of nature with the idea that the beauty came from nature's ordering system. And so the bounds of reeds and wheat became a column, a fluted column. The nautilus shell became the scroll of an Ionic capital. The acanthus leaf became the inspiration for the Corinthian capital. And the egg became the decorative part of the egg and dart molding that you see everywhere. If you copy nature, beauty will come. So let's take a look at a Greek building and see how some of these ratios and proportions here. We're going to take a look at the Parthenon. It's the Temple of Athena. built in the 5th century BC. This is the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. I don't think it's an accident that at the moment that the Greeks are reaching the peak of their philosophical history, they're reaching the peak of their architectural history as well. So this is a reconstruction of the Parthenon. Le Corbusier, who we'll see later on, the great modern architect from Switzerland, called the Parthenon the world's most perfect building. So here's a modernist who looked at the Greeks and said, this is the perfect building that's ever been made. Now, I didn't know this, most of you might, but it stood solid, resisting all the forces of nature for over 2,000 years until the 17th century, when we had one of those wars that we have occasionally. And at the time, the Turks occupied Athens, and the Venetians were trying to liberate them. And the Turks had turned one of the chambers into a mosque, and they had turned the other chamber into a arms depot, filled it with gunpowder, because that's where they were going to keep all their gunpowder. And then some spark somewhere during the battle ignited the gunpowder storage and blew up the building. But prior to that, it stood for over 2,000 years. This is the floor plan. Now, temples, very different from churches. In temples, you would go in small family groups with a priest of some sort, with an animal, or some sort of sacrifice to sacrifice on the altar in front of your god. The Parthenon had 2 chambers. The one in the back had the statue of Athena. But very traditional Greek building, there was the peristyle, the ring of columns around the 2 chambers. And if you look at that plan and you take our golden section, you will find that the 2 floor plans are in proportion to the golden section. Again, they had observed that there was something inherently pleasing about this ratio, and they imitated it. You spread those out, like if you could stretch them out, then the entire footprint of the Parthenon is 2 golden sections together. The front. Symmetry is highly important to Greco-Roman architecture because the feeling is the human body is symmetrical. Essentially it is. So they're very big on symmetry. They also developed something called entasis. So this, in a drawing, appears as a straight line. It's actually curved. What they were doing is they were beginning to correct optics so that a building would look straighter than it actually is. The buildings they were building at this point were so large that the human eye in perspective would begin to make things look sort of skewed. And so they would compensate by putting a slight arc in this, or change the taper of the column so that the column would appear straight and not taper too quickly. But if you look at the facade, you find that the overall height and the width is another golden section. That the height of the columns, 2 golden sections together. Sometimes I feel like there's people on TV who are looking for monsters or aliens, and they find them wherever they look. But I keep looking, I keep finding golden sections. Even on the triglyphs and the frieze, each individual triglyph or a combination of the bas-relief and the triglyph, golden section. So what they did was they built in ratios and proportions. Now this was, like most modern building prior to the 18th century, this was done without a uniform system of measure. It was all done with ratio and proportion. You would get a steel or an iron staff, I should say. It would be the fixed measure, and then everything would be measured according to that for this job. So if you wanted to build a huge building, you would get a big measure staff. If you want to build a smaller building, you might get a smaller building. You could build the same building in a different ratio, in the same ratio but in a different scale, just by having a different measure. And they would start this by taking the squarest stone they could create and put that at the corner of the building. And then everything would be measured from the corner of that building, hence our word cornerstone. So it's remembered from the Greeks, beauty is derived through the imitation of nature. Vitruvius, the Roman architect who taught us most of what we know about Greek architecture, Palladio, and even Frank Lloyd Wright would agree. Frank Lloyd Wright is called a modernist, but in the early part of his career, he was part of the arts and crafts movement, and he began by looking towards the nature of the United States, and he replaced the acanthus leaf with the wheat stalk, or the cornstalk, looking to nature first in order to find beauty outside of himself. We're getting to the Gothics now. Now, the term Gothic, the term medieval, the term Dark Ages, they get a lot of bad press. The Gothics was a slur that the Renaissance used to describe this kind of architecture. The Renaissance people, Giorgio Vasari among them, basically looked at all this architecture as some rude interruption to classicism. Okay? So when they began what we call the Renaissance, the rebirth of classicism, and they called modern architecture, they went back and they were writing about nasty things about all that stuff they were building up north. So when they said this was a Gothic building, that was a slur. That was basically saying these were the buildings built by the uneducated northerners. You know, those people who drink beer instead of wine, those people who use butter instead of olive oil. That's how crude they were. The Dark Ages, people confused with medieval time. The Dark Ages were basically the ages after a couple of hundred years after Rome fell. You want to place that, 400, 500 AD, and before Charlemagne began to establish some sort of order. So you had, Charlemagne was about 700, 800 AD. So you had a period about 300 or 400 years where there was no ruling authority, and basically there were bands of armies going everywhere doing whatever they want. And there was no one controlling things. Charlemagne comes along. They try to establish what they call the Holy Roman Empire, which was not quite holy, certainly wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire when he started either. Okay? But they had aspirations. Okay? By the way, even the term medieval, which doesn't mean partially evil, but actually it comes from Latin for in-between age, wasn't really coined until the early 1800s. Okay? So people weren't sitting around 1100 AD going, well, now that we're in the medieval period, what should we build? Garter argues that Christianity is the combination of Greek and Semitic philosophies, and talks about how those philosophies created what we want. And then his characterization of that was interesting, I found, because it reflected in the architecture. So Greek grew from the Indo-European roots. The word insight is a very ancient word. It goes back to Indo-European language. It has roots there. And what does that tell you is by seeing into someone, you could know something about them. It was a very visually oriented society. Okay? They were polytheists, and they saw the world as controlled by gods, but those gods were set apart from them. And there was a cyclical struggle between good and evil. So in the Greek mythology, the earth was created, destroyed. You had the Titans, and then you had the gods. They see it as cyclical. In the Semitic world, which is predominantly northern Africa, Arab, Jewish cultures, they were predominantly a verbal society. Even the Shema, the primary prayer of Jewish culture. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. I apologize because I learned all my Hebrew at Archbishop Stepanek High School. But what that says is, hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. Hear. It was a people of the word. They were sojourners. They couldn't carve big marble statues of things and carry it around with them. So they carried the word of God, they carried their history in their minds. It was an oral tradition. If Abraham is placed at about 1800 BC, Moses is placed about 1400 BC. Now, tradition says Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Hebrew Testament, the Torah. Scholars put it closer to like 400, 600 BC. But up until that time, certainly until the time of Moses, until afterwards, all those stories that we read every Sunday in the Old Testament, to the Christians, what we call it, were an oral tradition. That's why the readings in Genesis are so much fun, because I imagine those stories being told around the campfire at night, sitting around and say, Grandpa, tell us about, when God took us out of Egypt. Okay, sit around. All right, so there was Pharaoh. So these were the stories that were passed down. It was definitely a verbal society. And take a look at the book of John. How does it begin? Its concept of creation is, in the beginning there was the Word. The Word existed before the earth existed. So the Semitics were actually monotheists. There's a great theory that The Israelites got the concept of monotheism from one small period in Egypt when they were monotheists. Because if you look at the older books of the Torah, God is described as the God of Abraham, not the only God. The God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, that sort of thing. The concept of God creator came later in their culture, so that the first two creation stories are actually newer than, let's say, the stories of the Exodus. And they saw themselves as separated from God through sin. And their concept of the universe is very linear. It's creation, fall, redemption. End of the world. End of the world may come at the same time as the redemption. It's linear. It's not cyclical. So when you meld these two together, you get Christianity. A couple of fathers of the church, St. Augustine, 5th century A.D., he was a Roman, converted to Christianity. And Garter attributes him with taking Platonic philosophy and applying it to the theology of that new sect of Judaism called Christianity. In his world, then, Plato gave us a lot about ideal form. Remember, I was talking about the horse earlier. Plato said, contemplate a horse. We all know what a horse is. We have in our mind the ideal form. So we could find something that's a horse that maybe only has 3 legs. But we understand how that's a variant of the ideal form of the horse. And then ultimately, Augustine wrote the book, The City of God, which was about an ideal society. It was about manifestation of God's paradise. And that becomes important to the Gothic builders. We're going to sort of zoom forward philosophically to the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica. He sort of takes the Platonic concept and brings it to an application that basically says that there is order in nature. It was put there by God for man to discover with reason in pursuit of the truth. So in addition to revelation, there's also reason. What's interesting is, and then Christianity were followers of Plato, Aristotle became the favorite Greek philosopher of Islam. And as a natural philosopher, it was through his inspiration that we had alchemy develop. And so let's say the tools of the scientific method were developed in Islam as followers of Aristotle and preservers of Aristotle's knowledge, while Christianity, through the monasteries during the Dark Ages, preserved Western thought. A couple other inspirations. St. Benedict of Nursia, 5th century, wanted to be a hermit. He was hanging out. He found other people being a hermit, so they decided, let's all be hermits together. Eventually wrote the Rule of St. Benedict, which I thought was sort of a little bit presumptuous of him to write a book called The Rule of St. Benedict. But obviously it was called a rule when he wrote it, and we later, with their view of separating yourself from the physical world in order to find God, and take that all the way to St. Francis in the 12th century, where we had the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. What we saw here then was a philosophy that began to emphasize the spiritual over the physical, to the point where the physical world was really the source of all the problems. It was a world that caused pain. It was a world that tempted you. Even the good things in the earth were too tempting. So we went from the shift to the physical to the spiritual. A couple other things before we actually get into the architecture then. The Gothics had a different numbering system, and they began not to throw away all the Greek sense of proportion, but they began to organize their buildings around different numbers. God is the Trinity, so therefore the number of God is 3. Earth or man is 4. Why? Well, they still believed in the 4 elements: earth, wind, fire, water. The 4 winds. Earth was 4. So if you combine God and man, you get Jesus, 7. And if you multiply God and man, you get the apostles, or the tribes of Israel, 12. 12 is a great number for all sorts of other reasons, especially in a pre-metric or pre-measuring society. 12 is great because it's divisible by 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's why we have 12 eggs in a dozen. That's why we have 12 hours in a day, 12 hours at night. That's why we have 60 minutes in an hour, because it's divisible by 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, and 12, and 10. So, which Gothic building should we look at? I decided to pick Amiens for a couple of reasons. And again, Vasari was describing this building by using the phrase, that German style. Okay, Renaissance architect, he's looking at it going, look at this building, it's just absolutely awful. It's not even symmetrical. These two towers are different. What were they thinking? Okay, I picked it because it was built completely in the Gothic period. A lot of older buildings, such as Notre Dame de Paris, my wife will always correct my French, I apologize. It had Romanesque beginnings, it had a Romanesque plan, and then they added Gothic detailing to it. A lot of other Gothic churches were started in the Gothic period, so they had a Gothic plan, but they were finishing them in the Renaissance period, and they sort of lost their nerve and decided to go Renaissance. But Amiens is completely Gothic. And here's the quote, because people misread Gothic churches all over the place. So, from the City of God, it was about light. They were trying to capture the light that was the City of God. It's not about the pointed arches. It's not about the flying buttresses. Okay? But yet we are to believe that there was such a thing as light, whether it was material light proceeding from the upper parts of the world, or from the place where the sun was kindled, or whether it was a spiritual light, the holy city of God, with the holy angels and the blessed spirits, concerning which the apostles said in one place, which is the Jerusalem above, our eternal mother in the heavens. Every major Gothic church was inspired by this passage to recreate on earth the city of God. And so what they were pursuing was not pointed arches and not flying buttresses. Those were tools in order to give you a wall of light. It was medieval form follows function. Okay, this is not the original glass that was in Amiens. That was destroyed. But if you go there, if you go to Chartres, if you go to Notre Dame, you go to Sainte-Chapelle, you go to the Gothic buildings, and it was about transformative light. And it just so happens in the second week of the talk, I'll talk about how light and loft and craft are essential to all religions in building architecture for the ages, for God. So just think, you're a medieval farmer, and you get up with the sun, you go down, and you go to sleep with the sun, because you can't even afford candles. You've seen a rainbow, but it's out there. You walk into one of these buildings, and you're walking among rays of colored light all around you. It was the laser light show of its day. It was a transformative experience, because they had recreated the city of God, which is why there's so many statues all over the place. Because we saw before that there were blessed angels and blessed spirits, and there were even demons. Okay? Augustine theorizes that since demons are mortal, they're higher than men on the evolutionary scale. Not quite as good as angels, certainly not as good as God. Okay? So that's why the demons and the gargoyles are at the top looking down, because they're higher than you. And the Gothics were so convinced they were building for God that they finished all these statues on every side. If you ever went to St. Peter's on top, you saw the statues that line the top. They're not finished on the top, because the Renaissance architects couldn't be bothered, because they knew people weren't going to see it. They were going to see it from the plaza. The Gothics didn't care about that. They knew they were building for God. They finished every statue. And when they did build the saints, emphasizing the spiritual over the physical, they began to remove any sort of sensuality from them. The bodies are robed. The difference between men and women's bodies is almost imperceivable, because it wasn't about their physical bodies. It was their spiritual nature that was important. The plan of the Gothic cathedral. At this point, the idea of the nave and the transept imitating the cross was pretty much firmly established. That was emerging during the Romanesque period. We're looking at the nave and the transept. Each of these bays represents the vaulted arches, the growing vaults. And if you number them, you see that from the base to the transept is numbered 7, the number of Jesus. God plus man, 3 plus 4. The transept has 7 bays going across it, and there are 7 chapels at the head. the crown surrounding Jesus' head. And if you look, you'll find the golden mean. So that the four bays right behind the intersection of the transept and the nave are laid out as a golden section, and that just spreads out. And the length is determined by that. Looking from the choir loft, we have the golden section in terms of the floor tile pattern, and 12. Again, 12 is sort of an easy number because it's a nice way to divide it, but there's a reason there's 12 there, 12 sections. It's symmetrical. It's all those other things I talked about. Could easily have been 5. Just a word. People see that and go, there's swastikas on the floor. Like the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't Holy Roman or an empire, the Nazis, when they came along, adopted the swastika as a symbol. Prior to the Nazis, it had been a symbol of peace for a couple of thousand years. It's an imitation of a pinwheel or a flower pattern. And in a perfect case of public relations, trying to convince people that they were all about peace, they adopted a symbol of peace on their flag. So I know it's hard for generations to look at that and not think of Nazi Germany, but for thousands of years people did. And in fact, next session in 3 weeks, I'll show you swastikas on the Jerusalem temple. Again, I mentioned the idea of creating glass, minimalizing the wall, the pointed arch, which was discovered by Crusaders in Islam, but perfected by the Gothic architects. What it began to do was began to address the problem of Roman arches. Roman arches were pretty good, but they were perfectly round. So what they had was they had a problem of an outward thrust. And that outward thrust would make the arch collapse. So what they began to do was put other arches, and if you lined them all up, like in an aqueduct, you would keep them from falling down. If you put them in a big ring, like around the Colosseum, well, the pointed arch begins to force more of those forces down, and it begins to approach a more or less perfect structural anomaly, which is actually the parabola is a more perfect expression of the structural forces. And through the side aisles and the nave and the flying buttresses, we have the indication of a parabola. I don't know if you're familiar with Sagrada Familia in Barcelona by Gaudi, but a lot of the major arches are parabolas. I don't know if he did that through engineering or intuition, but he succeeded it. Take a look at the string. This is tension. And it creates a parabola. Okay, it's not a perfect arch. Compression, which is the opposite of tension, which is the force that stone uses, would be best expressed. So through trial and error, the Gothics were approaching a more pure structural expression. And, of course, I found golden sections. So for Gothic architecture, beauty was derived from spiritual perfection. Garter puts modern philosophy, starting with René Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. He had been inspired by Sir Francis Bacon and the other late medieval philosophers. Remember, medieval philosophy gave us the university and it gave us the scientific method. The scientific method said, well, let's throw out everything that we think we know, and let's look and let's test. And there's nothing that can be known through science. You can only disprove things. So when you disprove everything else, the best possible answer is approaching the truth, but it's not known until it too gets disproved, if it ever gets disproved. So René Descartes was impressed by that, so he was saying, philosophically speaking then, what can we possibly know? And the only thing he came up with this. So he must have been severely disappointed. Well, maybe not. I think, therefore, I am. The only thing you can possibly know is that you exist. So right now, I'm standing in front of here, and I'm not quite convinced all of you exist. Okay? In my mind, I'm standing in front of you, and I'm talking, and I might have just created all of you from my own imagination. Likewise, some of you should be thinking, there's no such thing as a person speaking at the front of the room. I know I exist, so it's possible that everyone else around me is a figment of my imagination or a creation. If you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, that's one of the concepts that's going on. Keanu Reeves is a human battery and is tied into a complete matrix of thought just to sort of create that illusion. 100 years later, Immanuel Kant is saying, well, yes, reason has its place, but it has limits, because we can only reason that based on what we can see, smell, touch, feel, taste, hear. But our physical world is limited. There may be something beyond that which we can't detect and we can't reason about. So that's why you need faith. You need revelation and belief in that revelation in order to have a complete human being. By the time we get to the 19th century, Karl Marx is saying that the struggle of the human being to try to know God is an illusion. And the real struggle of human being is a political one, class against class. And that religion was just this creation by people to distract them from the real problem, those who have power, those who don't. Charles Darwin, with his book and his research, basically was giving people an opportunity to envision a creation without God. That somehow things by their own nature existed and evolved. That, giraffes didn't spring up instantly on the 6th day or the 5th day. Sigmund Freud began to talk about the subconscious, and he was talking about how, with the id, he was sort of challenging this concept of free will. That if people had a subconscious that was making them do things, how can you hold them responsible? Because they were not expressing free will. They were a subject of pre-programming. And Friedrich Nietzsche sort of came out and said, God is dead. He was a creation. We needed him for a while. We don't need him anymore. This might all be messed up by the... then early 19th century again, Kierkegaard came along, and he started the concept of existentialism, which is sort of going back to René Descartes, saying the whole world is really defined in terms of me. He was really talking about your relationship with God. So it might have been an anti-church opinion, but it was certainly not an anti-God opinion. But by the time we got to Jean-Paul Sartre, we were basically saying that in terms of our own existentialism, we create everything, including God. It doesn't really exist. And so I think this is best summed up by that 20th century philosopher, Archie Bunker, who said, faith is something you believe in that no one in his right mind would believe in. Now, when the writer put those words in him, Archie was defending faith. But as someone of faith, I would say he's right, okay? When you use and you apply reason, then suddenly you reach a point where there's a limit and there's a stop. And you have to go beyond reason. And that's why I believe God has revelation, and that's the way to know God. So how does this relate to architecture? Well, architecture had been steeped in history. And if the modern philosophers were saying, throw out history, throw out preconditions, throw out all that other stuff, and let's just get back to basics, architects wanted to do the same thing. And they were aided by the development of steel and the development of sheet glass, so that your column and your window suddenly became minimalist, without decoration, and the entire wall could be a window. You didn't have to just punch holes in a wall. It became about elemental geometry, point, line, and plane. What little effort do you need in order to manifest a need? Modern architecture, because we don't have a better word yet, began in 1896 with Louis Sullivan. Form ever follows function. We know that today is predominantly form follows function. But the idea is that if you threw out history, you threw out all those other preconceptions, you could reach an architecture that was pure reason. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe gave us the phrase, less is more. So these were his buildings. Reducing the building to a point for the column, a line for an edge, and a wall being a simple plane. And glass, windows, being entire planes of glass. So when I was looking for a modern architect to pick, I decided to go with Charles-Édouard Jeanneret. He's so good as an architect, he could go by one name, Le Corbusier. He gave himself that name. It's actually derived from his grandfather's name. It means he who has a crow or something like that. Anyway, like Cher or Beyonce, he's such a good architect, he only needs one name. He's the one who had called the Parthenon the world's perfect building. He also said that the automobile was the Parthenon of the 20th century. And his view was that the automobile, as it was developing, and this is the kind of automobile, was pursuing engineering, and it was going to be ultimately devoid of historic decoration. And that he thought this is the way architecture should go. Now, if I pick him as an architect, which buildings of his should I pick? I could pick Ronchamp, which we will see the next session. But if I did that, then I would show you a building that is expressively spiritual. And that would undermine my entire premise. So I'm not going to study that building. Instead, we're going to go with Villa Savoy. This is a house built in 1928 through 1931. As we look at the pictures, people keep saying to me, 1928? Okay. So if you want to know where we get our inspiration, this is where Philip Johnson got his glasses from. Okay. And this is where Richard Meyer got his idea for the Long Island beach house from. Villa Savoy, built outside of Paris, 1928, by Le Corbusier. This is a section, point, line, and plane. So the columns are reduced to that which is structurally necessary. We're not going to make them thicker so they look like they're stronger because they're made of stone. We're not going to put a base on them. We're not going to put a capital on them. We're going to play with indoor and outdoor spaces. So this is an outdoor space on the second floor. Le Corbusier also playing this concept of driving the car into the house. You look at Frank Lloyd Wright's early modern buildings, and a lot of them had stables, because that's how old the modern era is, that they still had horse and carriage at the time. But they always had a separate building. Le Corbusier said, well, you can drive up right underneath the house and you wouldn't have to get wet. And then on the top level, there's a porch, but he also creates a wall out here so that your view of the hillside is framed by a window. We're used to seeing black and white pictures, so we always think modernism is devoid of color, but it's not. Minimalist form, point, line, plane. So for the moderns, beauty was derived from pure reason. Now, we're in this postmodern phase where, Frank Gehry is doing undulating steel buildings, and in Disney World, you can build whatever you want. You can build castles. It doesn't matter. So I think we're getting away from the modernist theory. So most of the buildings in the last 20, 30 years are actually idiosyncratic. They're architects trying to brand their style so they can get more jobs. So it's not about finding beauty outside of themselves. It's all about me. It's a very appropriate me generation kind of architecture. So to summarize, all of these three systems had a strong sense that beauty existed outside of their own personal being. And they looked towards nature or to God or to reason as a source of beauty. So in modern architecture, beauty was in the machine. In the Greek architecture, beauty was in the earth. Gothic architecture, beauty in heaven. Another way to phrase it, beauty in reason for the moderns. In Greek, beauty in physical nature. And in Gothic, beauty in spiritual perfection. And the last way to sum it up, what you've got then is the mind, the body, and the soul. So I think what we have is at least a 21st century concept of a total human being. That all three aesthetic systems have validity to us today because they spoke elementally about those things, about our nature, our mind, our body, and our soul. And I think there's enough room in the world for all three forms of architecture. So thank you. That's the formal part of the presentation. I'll take any questions that you might have.
There's no reference to Asia, Africa?
Yes.
The Pacific Islands, they don't have architecture?
No. This talk in its more secular form is called The History of Western Architecture.
Western architecture.
So I'm limiting it to that because my research and having visited more Western buildings, and I'm much more familiar with Western philosophy than I am with others. That's where next week we get a little more into Asian.
Oh, okay.
A lot of what I learned about the buildings that I'm talking about are things that I perceived having been to them without them appearing in a book or without them appearing or being told to me by a professor. That having a background that's a little more technical in addition to the artistic, I could see things that were practical about these buildings. So I cannot yet talk about Eastern architecture in the same way because I haven't been there. If anyone wants to sponsor a trip, I'll gladly come back next year with more on Eastern architecture.